Good morning and welcome to today's press conference. I'm Mia Rabson from the Canadian Press and I'll be moderating today's press conference. We have with us members of the Atlantic Liberal caucus. I'm told there will be 3 speakers, starting, I believe, with Kody Blois from King's Hants. And after the speakers, we will take questions in the room and then on Zoom. If you are online, please use the raise hand function. And off you go.
Thank you very much, Mia. As you mentioned, my name is Kody Blois. I'm the Member of Parliament for King's Hants, and I'm the proud chair of the Atlantic Liberal Caucus. And as you can see, I'm joined by my colleagues this morning from the Atlantic Liberal Caucus, representing all 4 Atlantic provinces. I will be delivering my remarks this morning on behalf of the entire caucus in both English and French, followed by brief remarks from Minister O'Regan and brief remarks from Minister Fraser. Following this, we'll be available to take questions, and Mia, I know you'll help us in facilitating those. Canada is in a global race towards our net zero future, and we are in the driver's seat to be a leader in supporting countries around the world to make that transition. Nowhere is that more so the case than in Atlantic Canada. And yesterday, our government tabled Bill C-49, an act to amend the Atlantic Accords that exists between the governments of Newfoundland and Labrador and the governments of Nova Scotia with the government of Canada. These were created to govern and manage the oil and gas sector. And the legislation tabled yesterday is supported by both governments of Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia because it builds on the existing success of those acts to be able to allow for the offshore wind industry in Canada to have a safe and supported regulatory pattern on their creation, by allowing the existing offshore petroleum boards to regulate that emerging offshore wind sector. I want to be very clear. The legislation is straightforward and has been drafted with deep consultation with the provinces. The legislation is required to give the certainty necessary to advance Atlantic Canada's clean energy future in the offshore, and it follows the existing established pattern of joint management, both provincial and federal, of the offshore resource which the Atlantic Accord has provided for decades. Which is why it is simply unbelievable that the Conservative Party of Canada yesterday signaled its intent to be against Bill C-49, that they will not be supporting this bill. And a total of 10 members of Parliament spoke yesterday, including the Shadow Minister for the Minister of Natural Resources, and saying that they will not advance this legislation. I want to be very clear. Our caucus views this as an attack on Atlantic Canada and the interests of our region. It is an attack on our ability to fight climate change and to be able to enable generational economic opportunities in our region that provide good jobs and will drive investment in our communities. The Conservatives are standing against that. They are standing against the wishes of 2 provincial governments, an entire clean energy industry, Indigenous communities, and Atlantic Canadians writ large that want to see this legislation advance to make a difference for our region. Therefore, the Atlantic Liberal Caucus is calling on the Conservative Party of Canada to support Bill C-49, an act to amend the Atlantic Accords, which is crucial for Atlantic Canada's clean energy future. We are asking them to stop being against Premier Houston, Premier Fury, and ultimately standing in the way of progress in Atlantic Canada. If the Conservative Party will not change its course, the Atlantic Liberal Caucus is calling on the 8 members of the Conservative Party that represent ridings in Atlantic Canada. We are asking them to break rank and support the interest of our region. It is paramount at this time, and we cannot believe why the Conservative Party will not stand up for Atlantic Canada. Donc, en français, très rapidement, le Canada est engagé dans une course mondiale vers un avenir sans émissions de gaz à effet de serre, et nous sommes en mesure de jouer un rôle premier plan en aide les pays du monde entier à opérer cette transition. Ce n'est nulle part ailleurs que dans le Canada atlantique que cela le plus vrai. Hier, notre gouvernement a déposé le projet de loi C-49, une loi visant à modifier les accords atlantiques conclus entre le gouvernement de Terre-Neuve et Labrador et de la Nouvelle-Écosse, qui ont été créés pour régir et réglementer les activités du secteur pétrolier et gazier. La législation présentée hier est soutenue par les gouvernements provinciaux de Nouvelle-Écosse et Terre-Neuve-et-Labrador, car elle ouvre la voie à la réglementation de l'industrie et aux liens en mer au Canada et permettant aux offices de hydrocarbures extra-côtiers existants de réglementer le secteur émergent de l'énergie éolien en mer. La législation est simple et a été rédigée après une consultation approfondie avec les provinces. Cette législation est nécessaire pour donner les certitudes nécessaires à l'avancement de l'avenir énergétique propre du Canada Atlantique en mer et elle suit le modèle existant de gestion conjointe provinciale et aussi fédérale de la ressource en mer que l'accord atlantique prévoit de dessiner. C'est pourquoi il est surprenant et incroyable que le Parti conservateur du Canada ait signalé hier à la Chambre des communes qu'il ne soutiendra pas ce projet de loi. Au total, 10 députés conservateurs ont pris la parole, y compris leur ministre fantôme, et aucun d'entre eux n'a indiqué qu'il était prêt à faire avancer le projet de loi, pas une seule. Notre caucus considère qu'il s'agit d'une attaque contre les intérêts du Canada Atlantique, à un moment où nous devons lutter contre le changement climatique et créer des opportunités économiques générationnelles dans notre région qui offrent des bons emplois et stimuler l'investissement dans nos communautés. Les conservateurs se opposent. Ils s'opposent au souhait du gouvernement provincial, de toute une industrie de l'énergie propre, des communautés autochtones et des habitants du Canada Atlantique qui savent qu'il est important de faire progresser cette industrie. Par conséquent, le caucus libéral de l'Atlantique demande au Parti conservateur du Canada d'appuyer le projet de loi C-49, loi modifiant l'accord atlantique, qui est crucial pour l'avenir énergétique propre du Canada. Nous leur demandons de cesser de s'opposer à un projet de loi soutenu par le Premier ministre Houston, le Premier ministre Fury, et en fin de compte de cesser de faire obstacle au progrès pour le Canada Atlantique. Si le Parti conservateur du Canada ne change pas leur direction, le caucus libéral de l'Atlantique demande aux 8 députés conservateurs du Canada Atlantique, en particulier de Terre-Neuve et de la Nouvelle-Écosse, de rompre la rang de parti et de défendre les intérêts de leur région. The last thing I'm going to say before I turn things over to Minister O'Regan and Minister Fraser for a few comments is this. We actually had a discussion at Atlantic Caucus this morning. And this is a trend that the Conservative Party has had for quite some time. We were reminded by MP Sean Casey, in fact, that it was in Stephen Harper's term that when the governments of New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island were seeking to be able to establish a third line of electricity generation between those two provinces to help support their future, Stephen Harper was not there. We were reminded that it was Bill Casey, the Member of Parliament for Cumberland-Colchester, who stood up for the Atlantic Accord and the interest of our region, was thrown out by the Conservative Party. So this is a continuing trend of the Conservative Party of Canada not standing up for Atlantic Canada and not being there at the time of need for our constituents in our region. I'm going to leave it at that on behalf of the caucus. I'm going to invite Minister O'Regan first to say a few brief words, followed by Minister Fraser, and then we are happy to take any questions from the media. Thank you.
I promised Kody I would tone it down a bit for my tirade in the House of Commons last night on this. I'm shocked that we're even here. I'm shocked. When we were introducing these amendments, I described the Atlantic Accord at home as something like a charter of rights and freedoms, but for prosperity. It is the underpinning of what was then a very nascent industry in oil and gas. And it brought stability, and it brought a regulatory environment that was competitive. And for us, it heralded in something very new for us. And now these are less amendments than they really are an evolution. You know, when we talk about an energy transition that might be happening, it is happening on the ground in Newfoundland and Labrador before my eyes. It makes me smile just to talk about it. It is incredible. As we move from oil and we expand and we look at renewables, This is so important. Having a competitive environment, having a competitive regulatory, I don't know, like competitive regulatory structure doesn't sound too sexy. It is exactly what we need. It's what drives investment. And so our idea was just to expand what industry knows, what governments know, what people know, and what has been working. Because, you know, the offshore industry right now in Newfoundland and Labrador is a mature industry and an evolving industry. But when I was writing speeches for the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador 25 years ago on this during Hibernia First Oil, we didn't know what we were doing. We really didn't. And now we do. And now we fly all over the world doing this. And this is exactly what we want to do for green hydrogen. It is exactly what we want to do for wind power. Time is of the essence. There is a shortage of copper and wind turbines around the world. We do not have time for foolishness, for utter foolishness, on partisan debates that are not founded in reality. We want to work with all sides on what is a new but extraordinarily promising industry, and an industry that workers in Newfoundland and Labrador are ready to seize. They do not have time for this unnecessary partisan politics that is not founded in fact and has no vision for the future. Let's move on amending the Atlantic Accord. Let's transition in the energy industry in this country. Thank you.
Look, thanks very much, folks. I'll be brief. I'm just reminded today during the last provincial election campaign that we had in Nova Scotia, where now Premier Houston said that his Progressive Conservative Party was a different party than the federal Conservatives with different values. I think that's evident today when you see the opposition to common sense legislation that's going to provide a regulatory framework for the offshore energy sector. In particular for the renewable offshore energy sector. What the legislation that we're dealing with does is provides a clear pathway for green energy projects in the offshore sector in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. It calls into question for me, whether Mr. Poilievre and his caucus believe that climate change is driven by human industrial activities, and if they do, whether they're willing to do anything about it. The reality is in my home province, in the past year, we have lived through a hurricane that has devastated my communities. The damage is still apparent everywhere I go. We have seen wildfires like much of the country that we have never seen before, and we have seen families lose loved ones during recent floods. The imperative to act is obvious, but even if you don't want to do it for environmental reasons, even if you don't want to do it because it's the right thing to do, you can't ignore the scale of the economic opportunity. The green economy in my province has been growing rapidly and is going to be part of our path to prosperity for a generation to come. Look at some of the work that Nova Scotia companies are doing, like Carbon Cure when it comes to sequestration technologies. There's other companies that are discovering new ways to have near frictionless hull paint for vessels that reduces their emissions by 20% and improves the cost of transporting goods. You see new companies in energy efficiency that are growing and hiring hundreds of employees. Taking advantage of different programs the government's put forward to help reduce emissions that are actually creating jobs in our community. Renewable energy has the underpinnings of a new industry that's going to help support our economy for the next generation. When I look at the opportunities, these are not some fictional ideas a generation from now. They're happening today. Look at the Everyone Fuels project, perhaps the most advanced green hydrogen project in the world. This is a $1 billion investment in my entire life in Nova Scotia. In rural Nova Scotia, we didn't have $1 billion investments. These are investments that are going to create thousands of jobs in communities that are not used to seeing these kinds of investments. There's offshore proposals for wind energy in communities like Sheet Harbour in my own constituency. And if you were to tell me 8 years ago that we would have a nascent industry turn into real opportunities that would create hundreds or thousands of jobs in rural Nova Scotia, I would have told you you were being unrealistic but optimistic, and I would have tried to help out. The reality is the course that we have put ourselves on has enabled these kinds of investments. And expanding the offshore regulatory framework to include wind energy, to include green energy, is clearly the next step in the process. Frankly, I thought this was going to be the simplest piece of legislation that all parties could get behind. The decision to oppose C-49 is one that makes no sense unless you simply want to oppose it for the sake of being critical of the government rather than being critical of their ideas. The reality that I'm staring down the barrel of now is that we have an opportunity to invest in the green economy and the new economy if we want to create opportunities so kids who grow up in rural Nova Scotia can continue to live in Nova Scotia and raise their kids in Nova Scotia. This is the kind of thing that inspired me to get involved in politics in the first place. And when I see the opposition making a boneheaded decision to oppose green energy in my home province, it's the kind of thing that inspires me to continue my work on Parliament Hill. My call to action for my Conservative colleagues from Nova Scotia is to give your head a shake. Get behind green energy in our province. We're going to be watching very closely how they vote, and I hope sincerely that they change their minds. Thank you very much.
Indeed, it has inspired us all to be here today on behalf of the Atlantic Caucus to call on the Conservative Party to change course. But Mia, that wraps up our portion. We're happy to take questions from the media.
Okay, as I said earlier, we'll start with questions in the room and then we will move online. If you are online and want to ask a question, please use the raise hand function, and we will start with Adam Harris from the New Brunswick Telegraph-Journal.
Hi there. I had a question about the clean fuel regulations. It's clear in Atlantic Canada that the regulations are having a disproportionate impact compared to elsewhere in the country. That's because the region's refinery exports the majority of its fuel to New England. It isn't getting the green credits for it, and then that's being passed on to pumps across the region. Is your caucus asking its own government to change policy or give some kind of extra incentive to Atlantic Canadians to offset that? I mean, this isn't the carbon tax where you get the rebate back. This is the clean fuel standard.
A couple things that I'll say, Adam, on that. First of all, you rightfully highlight that the policy that we have in place is to try to actually create cleaner fuel standards, and we're working with refiners across the country to do just that. Irving is a bit of an exception in the country in the fact that it exports a lion's share of the product that is produced and is extremely important in Atlantic Canada. What I will say is that our government has taken opposition to the way that in which the calculation was done on the 8 cents a litre that was imposed in New Brunswick. For example, in my province, it's around 3 cents in Nova Scotia. I believe it's around 3 cents in Newfoundland and Labrador. So we understand that there will be some cost brought on as a result of this policy. But Adam, what people have not been talking about is the projects that are actually happening as a result of the clean fuel standards. Seamus could talk about in Newfoundland that come by chance, $87 million in investment there. We've had Irving, the same company has invested in electrolyzer. In Halifax, $90 million. The premiers have highlighted some of their concerns about the impact in Atlantic Canada. We as an Atlantic Caucus will always be working with the government to make sure that our region is protected. That's what we're doing today. That's what we continue to engage on the government in terms of our discussions. But I want to make sure something is very clear. There is also a piece here that is not being talked about, which is the tremendous economic opportunities that are being generated as a result of the projects that are going on by Irvin's decarbonization in Atlantic Canada as well. No one's talking about that, and I hope you can start doing some of that as well.
I didn't really hear much of whether or not Atlantic Canadians will be compensated for that 8 or 4 or 3. But I have a question about the Shenectady Isthmus as well. There's a bill introduced in the Senate yesterday that would see Ottawa take ownership completely of the strip of land between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Is this caucus pushing its own government to pay more than 50% of the tab on this? We just went through another hurricane. Some Atlantic Canadians count themselves lucky that Nova Scotia is not an island, right?
Yeah. Look, Minister LeBlanc has been very clear on this, that we are willing and being able to be there at 50%. Province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Houston has suggested that on their legal analysis, they think that the Government of Canada could be responsible for more. Our position is, if that is indeed the case, of course, we will be there to support. But we are willing to be partners with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick on that project. We know how important it is. And right now, it's about having the provinces actually advance what that project is to the Government of Canada, and we are more than willing. I can say not only the entire Atlantic Caucus, but particularly the Nova Scotia and New Brunswick members of it want to see that project happen. We're at the table right now with 50%. If we're expected to contribute more as per a legal decision, we'll be there to do so.
We'll turn now to Davis Legree from iPolitics.
Thanks. This question's for anyone, but perhaps Minister O'Regan, you'd like to chime in. On the subject of C49 and the Atlantic Accords, the benefits of staying up in the offshore wind industry are obvious, but what would you say to Atlantic Canadians and in particular Newfoundlanders and Labradorians who still have a sour taste in their mouth after Muskrat Falls and are worried that this bill will just bring a slew of mega projects?
Seamus, I'll let you answer it from.
Big difference in projects that are being funded by investors and being and projects that are being funded on the backs of ratepayers, which was the case with Muskrat Falls. And that was the biggest issue with Muskrat Falls. And in fact, it all kind of comes together because one of the ways we were able to get a rate mitigation deal for the province of Newfoundland and Labrador to get them the funds so they could mitigate those rates was by using net profit interest from Hibernia. And for that, you know, and back to my point of nonpartisanship, I have very publicly thanked John Crosby, may he rest in peace, his legacy very much still with us, when he did an amazing deal with oil companies when the government of Canada came in an equity position in order to hold together Hibernia in its early days. He said, well, from here into perpetuity, we'll get a cut of everybody else's profits. The government of Canada has realized about $3.3 billion of that. We figure for the life of Hibernia, it's about another 3.2. That we cobbled together with future loan guarantees. We got $5.2 billion for the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, which they said that they would put towards rate mitigation. So there's the difference. What we're seeing right now with, you know, I think 4 have been approved through phase 1, and I think that there's one that's continuing. It's on a brownfield site, so 5 with I think 4 more in the hopper. This is an incredible amount of investment going towards green hydrogen. A lot of that has to do with our proximity to Europe. I'm very happy about the fact that it takes me forever to get to Ottawa, but that also means we're a lot closer to Europe, and that is finally being used as a competitive advantage. And I never thought that this is something that we could do. You know, when a Newfoundlander realizes that you can monetize wind, this is a good day. When I was at Stephenville Airport to see the German Chancellor get off his private jet with the CEOs of Siemens and Mercedes-Benz and say we could invest anywhere in the world, and even though you guys haven't even started this industry yet, we think you've got the know-how, the wind, the natural resources, but the know-how and the workers. These same workers who work in our oil and gas fields and same workers who work in the offshore, they're the ones who are going to be able to do this. They're the ones who are doing it. I can't believe it. So what do we need right now to make sure that it prospers, it continues to attract investment, is a stable regulatory environment that investors know, have trusted for decades. And you just expand that so that it includes renewables. That's why I can't believe I'm here. You know, Sean and Kody have said it before. This to me was one of those things that brings us all together, every side of the house. But anyway, and I haven't heard anything coherent from the other side on this, like nothing. Thank you.
Switching gears a little bit, where are we at with the Atlantic Loop? In the spring, Minister Wilkinson said he was hoping for a agreement in principle in short order, and obviously it hit a snag in the summer. Some provinces are hoping the feds will put up more money. Are you pushing your government to make this more of a priority?
Well, it has been a priority right since day one, and I want to give credit to Minister LeBlanc, Minister Wilkinson, and certainly Minister Fraser behind me, because I know this has been something that they've been involved in. And although a lot of the focus right now is on Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, this makes sense for the entire region, long term. And what we're talking about here today on the offshore wind opportunity, the Atlantic Loop 3 or 4 years ago would have been Atlantic Canada's way to get off coal-fired generation. I would say today, given the opportunity, assuming we can get this legislation through and we can keep moving forward, which we will, there's an opportunity for Atlantic Canada to actually provide electricity generation back to Quebec, Ontario, the rest of the country. But we need that transmission line. And I know those conversations are ongoing. I will leave it to Minister Wilkinson to provide the finer details, but I know there is active conversation with Premier Higgs and Premier Houston on exactly how to do that. We have to generate the electricity. That's part of what we're talking about here today, but we also have to be able to transmit it. We are fully on board to making sure that that's a national project that we're working together. And I believe Minister Wilkinson will have more to say on that with the premiers in a few short weeks.
Olivia Stefanovic, CBC News.
Good morning. I'm here for both CBC and Radio Canada, so if you could repeat your answers in French, that'd be much appreciated. My first question, I'd just like to know where your caucus stands on compensation for farmers who will be displaced by these wind offshore projects. Do you believe that these fishermen deserve compensation, and how much?
So you mentioned farmers, you mean fishers?
Yes,
okay,
thank you.
Look, what I would say is part of the work that is going on. I'm happy to let any of my ministerial colleagues join in, but there's ongoing work right now by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada to actually look at a regional assessment of where best to be able to put these wind resources that are being planned and moving forward. Part of those conversations about where to be able to put these offshore wind facilities and how to be able to manage with stakeholders is with the Impact Assessment Agency. Any types of compensation or impact would be things that could be dealt with at the board level. Right now, that's the Offshore Petroleum Board in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador, which will be renamed the Offshore Energy Regulator. We're looking at whether or not there can be delineated powers there, and the Impact Assessment Agency is actually engaging with fishermen groups right now today to be able to try to understand how that those two things can coexist and we can move forward. I don't know if there's anything else to add on behalf of that. Oh wait, ok. Non, c'est donc avec la compensation pour la pêcherie, nous avons un processus maintenant avec l'Impact Assessment Agency, l'organisation qui ont le travail d'étudier l'espace en mer où la meilleure place de situer les infrastructures, les éoliens. Et bien sûr, la conversation existe avec la pêcherie, toutes les parties prenantes et aussi les organisations, les régulateurs pour s'assurer que les investissements pour les éoliens et aussi les intérêts de toutes les parties prenantes sont en place. Anything? Okay, good. Anything? Follow-up?
Okay, thank you. For my second question, I'd like to direct this question to the ministers in the room, so Minister O'Regan, Fraser, and Petitpas-Taylor. Some of your constituents in Atlantic Canada say they're going without food and even wearing blankets to keep warm in their homes. And some of your colleagues are asking for higher rural rebates for the carbon tax. And I'm wondering if you support them.
Yeah, sure. And look, I'm guessing all of us would be happy to speak to this. One of the things that we've got to appreciate is that there's no silver bullet to the affordability challenges, and we need to look at different solutions to different unique problems. But we know that inflation's had a very real impact on Canadian families, including in our home provinces. We will look for flexibilities on different programs that have a unique impact for Atlantic Canadians. But we're also going to continue to put measures forward that support them directly. Most recently, you would have seen some of the measures that we've advanced to help address the housing crisis, so more people are able to find a home that they can actually afford. You'll have seen some of the news coming out of the recent conversations with Francois-Philippe Champagne and some of the major grocers to help protect Canadians against the rising cost of food. But you'll have seen, going back to 15, a concerted effort to focus on measures that help middle-class Canadians and low-income Canadians, ranging from improvements to old age security, the Canada Child Benefit, benefits for students, the Canada Workers Benefit, the list goes on. I think you take the point. My priority is going to be making sure that people who live in my community can afford to buy groceries, can afford a place to live. To the extent we need to continue to examine all of our policies, not just a rural rebate, but all of our policies, and be flexible where the situation warrants, of course, that's what we'll do. Of all the things that we've done successfully in government, some of the most positive feedback that I took in 8 years as a member of Parliament was during the pandemic, not just because we put supports forward to help people who were vulnerable, but because we iterated. We listened to people and shifted course where necessary when we heard it was important. With all of our policies, we're going to continue to listen to our constituents and do what we can to be flexible wherever possible. Thank you.
Olivia, I'll address maybe your first question too, just to say that talks are ongoing between ourselves and the provincial governments. The more that we can have good regulation developed on the ground, the better. The province is very keen to take a very active role in this, and frankly, it's in keeping of the spirit of the Atlantic Accord that you have the Government of Canada and the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador work very closely together in a nimble way to make sure that we get this industry right. And to Sean's point, first and foremost, whether you're a cabinet minister or not, you're a member of Parliament. I'm a member of Parliament for St. John South, Mount Pearl. There is no single bigger issue right now in my riding than affordability issues. Nothing. That is something I take in my seat in Parliament. It is something that I take in the cabinet room. And I can tell you there are probably very few people in the country that are more literate on the issues of energy affordability than Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. It's something that maybe escapes the rest of the country, but the issue of Muskrat Falls rate mitigation dictated our politics for the better part of 10 years. You know, it's all people could think about or talk about. The notion that their energy bills would effectively double, if not more, and thrown tens of thousands of people under the poverty line in a province of only 500,000 people, it's all we could talk about. We had an inquiry into it even before it was finished, and it's still not completely finished. So we are very keen to make sure that affordability is the #1 priority as we go through this energy transition. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jeanette. Yeah.
Bonjour tout le monde. Premièrement, très bonne question. Puis c'est sûr que toute la question d'abordabilité continue à être notre priorité pour le gouvernement. Je pense qu'on regarde notre feuille de route au cours des dernières 8 années, la question d'abordabilité puis faire sûr qu'on a des programmes pour les Canadiens et Canadiennes a toujours été notre priorité. Je pense, comme mes collègues l'ont si bien dit, plusieurs programmes que nous avons mis sur pied à aider les Canadiens, mais évidemment, avec le coût de l'inflation, c'est sûr qu'on doit continuer à faire du travail. Voilà pourquoi nous avons annoncé des initiatives pour toute la question de logement. Le ministre Fraser a fait des bonnes annonces la semaine dernière, puis nous allons continuer à s'assurer que la question d'abordabilité va être la priorité principale pour le gouvernement, puisqu'on reconnaît que les Canadiens d'un bout à l'autre du pays ont la difficulté, puis on veut être là pour les appuyer.
And Mia, I just want to be clear, we will of course address the folks in the room, but we do have a lot of regional media from Atlantic Canada, and we will be here to answer their questions as well for those journalists that are on the line. Okay.
There are a few online, although none of them have their hand up at the moment. So I
Okay,
will
well,
reiterate to those online, if
we've
you
been
want to
so
ask a
thorough.
question, put your hand up. Use the raise hand function, please. Alex Ballingal, Toronto Star.
Thank you very much. More of like a big picture political question for the region. My understanding is that the Conservatives basically smell blood in Atlantic Canada, and they see a lot of potential to pick up a lot of your seats and the seats of your colleagues in the region. How do you guys feel about that? What do you think, if anything, has gone wrong for the Liberal Party in the region, and why do you think your rivals see such potential on your turf?
So, Alex, what I would say is we're here today because this is in the interest of our constituents. As Minister O'Regan said, this isn't just about politics. We want to make sure there's a contrast. We stand here today on a piece of legislation that matters to the interests of Atlantic Canada, and we want to be very clear on that. We're not trying to politically grandstand. We're trying to draw attention to an issue that we think is fundamental in the region, and we're encouraging the Conservatives to get on board because we think the main official opposition party in the country should matter for the interests of Atlantic Canada. We talked about this a lot in London. Polls are a snapshot in time. There's not an election happening tomorrow. Any politician that gets involved in public life is obviously going to be concerned if they want to continue to do a good job and they want to be reaffirmed by their constituents that they're doing a good job, they want to get reelected. So of course, we're not complacent. We want to make sure at the end of the day, Alex, that we're doing right by our constituents, we're doing right by Canadians, and we think that that'll take care of itself in terms of our reelection and our focus moving forward. But there's not an election tomorrow. It's 2 years out, and we're going to focus on delivering for Canadians, delivering for our Atlantic Canadians that we represent as well, and we'll let the polls take care of themselves.
Mind if I supplement that?
Sure.
One of the things that I think we should all acknowledge is that people are feeling very anxious. I think the rising cost of living has put a lot of families in a precarious situation, and I think people from every political party know that. I do think there's an attempt to politicize people's fears and to turn them against a government who happens to be the government of the day because people are struggling. But all parliamentarians, in my experience, are focused on advancing solutions. But when you actually dig into what the solutions are that different parties are proposing to support people, I don't think what the Conservatives are pitching is going to resonate in Atlantic Canada. It's one thing to speak to people's anxieties. It's another thing to advance solutions. If I actually look at some of the proposals, or not just over the past few weeks, but over the past few years that Mr. Poilievre suggested, he seems allergic to investing in healthcare. He's campaigning on a commitment to essentially cut dental care. Their housing plan says they're going to cut the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is going to build more homes for Canadians, in many instances at prices that regular people can afford. Previously, he has, for reasons I can't possibly understand, promised to axe the very programs that support Canadians during their time of need by undercutting the financial formula for things like the Canada Pension Plan and EI, which are very important, particularly in seasonal industries. When he was actually a minister in the Harper government, they changed the age of retirement from 65 to 67. their record is one of high unemployment and low jobs. And frankly, one of the things that motivated me to get involved in politics in the first place, when Mr. Poilievre was actually the minister responsible for ESDC, was the attitude that led Prime Minister Harper to describe Atlantic Canada as a culture of defeatism. This is not okay. And I continue to see these attitudes when they attack the programs that my constituents rely upon, particularly during their time of need. Look back to what happened during the pandemic, when we were advancing programs that kept workers on payroll and food on the table for families and literally keeping the doors open and the lights on in local businesses. Mr. Poilievre, yesterday in the House of Commons, when Minister Freeland said he described them as big fat government programs, more or less started cheering for himself. When somebody starts to believe in their own mythology, thinking they're better than anything that's happened in Canadian politics because they're promising to cut benefits that people rely on, it demonstrates to me they don't understand what Atlantic Canadians are going through. They might be able to speak to their anxieties, but everyone in politics can do that. But it's not enough to speak to someone's anxieties. You actually have to advance solutions that help them out in their time of need, and that's what we're focused on.
I was just going to add that I don't think it's so much targeting Atlantic Canada, Alex, as you know, they've identified that Atlantic Canadians, like every other Canadian, is worried about issues of affordability. And therefore the things that they're, saying in some parts of the country will, perhaps resonate in Atlantic Canada. And because people are worried about affordability, it does resonate somewhat. The emotions, the rubbing the nerves raw. But at the end of the day, this is about getting some public policy done, getting some good things done. They have managed, and I'm listening to their arguments yesterday in the House. It's just, for me, it's just very frustrating. I know the file fairly well, and to listen to nothing but platitudes, my God. This stuff, it's real though, right? I mean, a lot of us who've been around Ottawa now long enough that we kind of just write this off as talking points. But in action, if it's actually happening, then you are getting in the way of something that is extraordinarily important and something that I thought, frankly, rose above partisanship. I have a fairly good reputation on working with all sides of the House. We got 10 paid sick leave days done unanimously. I'm making a challenge now to do the same with replacement workers, and on some energy issues, we've been able to find common ground. But on this one, I mean, they're just, using Atlantic Canada conveniently, I think, for some talking points on other things that, get them through the day. But this is real to me. This is real to us. This is an incredibly important industry. We are racing against other jurisdictions in order to be able to get it right, and getting the regs right is important. It can be a real competitive advantage, and the sooner you land them and the more stable they are, the more investment you'll start to take in that otherwise would have gone somewhere else. We got a great basis. We got this with this regulatory regime under the Atlantic Accord that works. It has paid off. It has created an industry. It is now going to evolve and create a brand new one. I just don't have time for the shenanigans. Like, there's sometimes I'll play. On this one, I won't, and I just don't understand where they're coming from. I really don't. And if they're trying to make inroads in Atlantic Canada, this is precisely not the way to do it. The partisan side of me would say, go to town. But to be honest with you, there's too much money and too many jobs. Like, come on.
Just on that, picking up where you left off there, Minister, can you guys give me a succinct and clear explanation of why this bill, C-49, is so essential to having green energy take off in the region?
I'll address this. As you can tell, we're storytellers, and we like to give good, long, robust answers. C-49 is amending the Atlantic Accords, Alex. And the Atlantic Accords were agreements that were struck between the governments of Newfoundland and Labrador and Canada, and then subsequently the government of Nova Scotia and Canada, to regulate the offshore oil and gas sector. You can appreciate back in the 1980s when there was oil found in Hibernia in Newfoundland and Labrador, there was some questions around who actually had purview over that resource, how was it going to be managed, how best to be able to move forward. It was the Mulroney government at the time that I think promised and brought in the Atlantic Accord. There's been subsequent agreements along the way since, but there is a great regulatory framework to already establish the way in which the oil and gas sector operates, shared jurisdiction between the Government of Canada and those two provincial governments I just mentioned. When we look at the offshore wind energy industry, we need that same regulatory certainty. We are, as a government, in support with the provincial governments, industry, Indigenous communities. I near say almost every Atlantic Canadian believes in this direction of where we're going. We need to have that regulatory certainty so these companies have a pathway to be able to build these projects that are going to make a difference. we are leveraging the existing regulatory framework, the existing regulatory bodies to say, you've already done great work. Let's make sure we continue on that. The question you should have for the Conservative Party, Alex, is why are they against this? I sat in the House of Commons for the entire debate yesterday. They could not point to one single provision why they're against this. And then they started to get cute. They started to say, well, we believe in the principle, but we have problems with the legislation. Well, let's get it to committee. Let's move this legislation forward because it matters for Canada, it matters for Atlantic Canada. And the question that all of you should have in this room, indeed Canadians watching on that screen, why is the Conservative Party against this piece of legislation? They have yet to be able to articulate why, and Atlantic Canadians need answers. Maybe we could go to regional.
Yes, I'm going to come back to myself, though, because I'm going to take off my moderator's hat at the end of this and ask questions for my day job.
Great.
But we will start with Pat Healy from Laker News. Please go ahead. You have one question and one follow.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. If the amendment bill doesn't get passed, what does that mean for Atlantic Canada, Kody?
Well, the good news, Pat, look, first of all, great to hear from you back in Nova Scotia. Thanks for tuning in with us here in Ottawa, Pat. The good news is the NDP and the government, us, the Liberals, have signaled that we are going to support this. So there is a majority in the House that are signaling that this is going to move forward. But it's important that we move this bill forward quickly. Minister O'Regan talked about we're in a global race. So every day that this piece of legislation sits in the House of Commons and is not advanced to the Senate and is not ultimately approved is another day that we're losing in that global race. And so we are calling on the Conservatives today, Pat, to help support us, get this legislation to committee. If they do have any problems with the bill, which they have not yet been able to articulate very well, if at all, then let's get it to committee and let's study it. That's exactly what committees are for. But we need to be able to move this bill forward. So the good news, Pat, is it is going to move forward. The question is how quickly and whether or not we're going to have support from the House to do so. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Do you have a follow-up question, Pat?
Yes, I do. If they vote against it, what does that say about their outlook towards Atlantic Canada?
Yeah, well, that's exactly why we're here today, Pat. I think it sends a pretty strong signal that they are against a progressive Conservative government in Halifax. They are against Andrew Furey's government in St. John's. They are against a clean energy industry that's looking to get off the ground. They are against Indigenous communities that want to partner on these projects. They're against a whole lot. And I've tried to, in my remarks today, Pat, set a pattern of behavior here. We talked about the third link between New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island under the Harper government. We talked about how Bill Casey was kicked out of the Conservative caucus for standing up for Atlantic Canadians in a subsequent Atlantic Accord in 2007, where the Conservative government was looking to claw back the interests of Atlantic Canada. So the Conservative Party is going to have to answer for this. We're trying to do that today by making sure that it's on record, and we'll let Atlantic Canadians make the decision. But I'm pretty confident, Pat, that my constituents back home and the people in Nova Scotia, the people in Newfoundland, Labrador, and indeed the whole region, I think would be troubled by the position the Conservatives have taken yesterday.
At the moment, I do not see any other hands raised, so I will ask one more time if you do have a question online to put up your hand. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you, we had a poll recently that suggested that while Canadians are very concerned about climate change, and most of them have been affected by it, affordability is an issue, and their support for things to affect climate change or deal with climate change is a lot lower when it costs them money. How much of an issue is that in trying to sell your climate policies to your constituents?
Well, I'll give you an example right now, Mia. This is not about taking money out of anyone's pocket. This is about creating great jobs for the green economy. This is about drawing foreign direct investment from around the world of companies that want to come to Atlantic Canada and want to invest here. And it also is good for the environment. So sometimes there's this juxtaposition that it's either environment or the economy. Those two things go hand in hand. We're asking the Conservatives to understand that. It's been 8 years. I've been here for 4 of it. They haven't seemed to have been able to figure that out. These two things, I'll agree, Mia, at times, can be a tough balance. But we are the government that is responsibly trying to find that balance to make sure that we advance the jobs of today and tomorrow, do our part for climate, but do our part for the economy at the same time.
But it seems that the concern of many is that the jobs of tomorrow aren't going to pay their heating bills or fill up their gas tanks today. How are you convincing them that your climate policies are actually worthwhile when they are having to go to food banks or can't afford to pay their heating bills?
And again, I can appreciate the conversation where you're trying to tie those two things together. As Minister Fraser said, we are laser focused on affordability. I came out of caucus in London, seeing the initiatives that we're putting on the table to try to help support housing, seeing the initiatives that we're putting on the table to try to help support small businesses. We're doing both at the same time. And in fact, the moment calls for it. We have to be able to be focused on driving climate change and making a difference. In fact, we're the only government in the history of the country that has reduced emissions and continued to grow the economy at the same time. So I know that that anxiety is real. I was on over 1,000 doorsteps in my own riding this summer. And as Minister O'Regan said, affordability is top of mind, and I dare say every MP would say this as well. So we're going to continue to focus on that. I don't see them as being mutually exclusive. We can go and make sure that we're fighting on climate change because that's what Canadians do expect, but we can make sure that we're focused on their pocketbook at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive.
Okay, seeing no other raised, oh, you want?
Seamus might want to file.
I think too often too that we just, you know, the energy transition is just seen by some as something punitive. And when you stand in Argentia, Newfoundland, and you see I didn't even know these things existed, but, and this will be the first one in North America, I believe, but a monopile marshalling port, where, you know, what they're doing is stockyarding all the foundations for wind turbines that will be used up and down the eastern seaboard. You know, and this is a place that was used to build the gravity-based structure for the West White Rose Oil Project. It's the same workers, they're moving over. It's that transition is happening, these jobs are happening, right? And I think the more that people see these things happening, the more they realize that there is real opportunity here and that it is happening. I mean, just up the road from that is the Come By Chance oil refinery, and I joke because it looks like something out of Mad Max. In fact, back in the day, in the 1960s, it showed that Newfoundland and Labrador was on the cutting edge of the energy industry. And now it's being used to make sustainable aviation fuel and biodiesels. And people, you know, get it and they realize it. It is so important that we bring workers on side on this. And I was saying this long before I was Minister of Labor. I was saying it when I was Minister of Natural Resources and before. Because those are my constituents. And they wanted to see the upside of all this instead of, you know, just feeling bad that they're not doing their bit because they're involved in an industry which is contributing. They want to know that that industry is changing, evolving, and that there are new industries coming about. But it's competitive. It's very competitive. We've got a huge advantage in that the German Chancellor decided to fly to Stephenville and look to Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia as jurisdictions where they can do this sort of thing. But time is of the essence. We don't have the time. And you know, I think, Alex, you asked earlier, like, succinctly, what is this really all about? You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, you know, when I was Minister of Natural Resources and we were looking, and this was starting, it was like, well, this works. So let's amend it. Let's allow this to evolve. It's what industry knows. It's what people know. It's a process that we know, and it will save us a lot of time. I mean, I don't know, for a party that, you know, says they don't like government and red tape, it sounds to me like the only way they're going to get around is by building more government-y things. I mean, this is the most efficient way to go about this. This is the most effective and time-sensitive way to go about this. This is a huge opportunity for our region. My God, we're going to monetize wind, and it's going to be green power. Like, we don't want to get in the way of this. And we won't, but I don't know. They will. I don't know.
Okay. So seeing no other raised hands online, I'm going to bring an end to this press conference. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much, everyone.